What's up, y'all? Welcome back to part 2 of our first draft of Tiananmen. Actually, I think I did one 2 years ago.
Yeah, we always mention every year.
That one was just it definitely at least gets mentioned, but with this new history, whatever segment podcast, I would like to start doing some more deep dives into history. So where we left off was talking about Hu Yaobang and his radical acts, such as saying that we should, Chinese people should eat with forks and knives. It's real radical. Drinking soup too loudly. It was another radical act that he actually was forced to resign. So he ends up being forced out in 1987 because he refused to purge a group of radical intellectuals, the worst kinds of people. Am I right, Ari?
No comment.
Just kidding. I don't believe that. One of these guys, some listeners may have heard of. His name was
Jordan Peterson.
I think the Communist Party is too pro-transgender, and it makes me really uncomfortable.
No, it was Fang Lizhi, as every documentary on the internet that has people who are I guess even some of the Mandarin speakers, because they have the Beijing accent, but especially foreigners, they always say Fang Lizhi. But Fang Lizhi he was a famous scientist. You know about this guy, Ari?
Nope.
Well, during H-Dubs, Bush Sr., and he went to Beijing to play nice with the communists.
Wait, so the era you're talking about is the lead up to the 89 Tiananmen, so we're not
Yes.
in the 70s anymore.
No, we are deep into the 80s.
Okay.
We're rapidly approaching real.
So what was his position that he was getting purged from again?
Why I don't have this in my brain. Good question.
Yeah, man. That's history. Names and dates.
Hell yeah, the worst. He was a general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party.
He was the general secretary.
Mm-hmm.
That's the highest position, I would say.
Yeah, but in terms of actual power at the time, obviously he was number 2 to Dung.
So what was Deng's position at the time?
He was the chairman of the Central Advisory, and he was also the chairman of the Central Military Commission.
Interesting. So, because right now, the typical understanding is that the Secretary General of the party is the head of the country, more or less,
right,
because the party is in control of the country. But
right.
Yeah, so that's interesting.
There's been a lot of those shifts, and there have been a number of positions that have come and gone as well, where they basically get rid of it and elevate another position to said position.
Mm-hmm.
So it gets very confusing, but suffice to say, he's number 2 right now. But he gets pushed out because he refuses to purge these people like Feng Lizhi, who will be a man very close to your heart, Ari, as he is a fellow scientist.
Yeah, but what kind of scientist? I don't like all scientists.
He was a
music scholar.
Nuclear physicist. No, I'm just kidding. I was just trying to think of a scientist that I thought you wouldn't like.
Nuclear physicists it depends. Depends which country they work for.
Oh, which country? So what's your favorite kind of scientist is the question.
Well, obviously political. And what kind of question is that?
What about chemist?
Chemists are okay.
I think chemists...
They have depends on their style.
The chemists that I know seem to be pretty decent people, but I would say I have a pretty small sample size. What about astrophysicists?
I've never met any.
Well, you're listening.
Just going by Neil deGrasse Tyson for my stereotypes.
Well, yeah, that's not a good stereotype to have. I think he's.
I mean, the Key and Peele skits about him.
He can be interesting sometimes, but he's also very annoying. He was his last big thing that I saw on Twitter was he was basically yelling at people for
Get vaccinated with more Pfizers.
for being excited about there was an eclipse. He's like, this is like nothing special. Stop being so excited. It's like, wouldn't you want people to be interested in science? Or I don't know. It's just like, it seems like kind of a dickhead thing to do. But I don't know. I don't want to.
Yeah, Twitter's not real, anyways.
That's fair. That's fair. But we all live in a simulation. So is anything real? Probably not. So, yeah, I'll talk a little bit more in depth about this later. But basically, HW goes to Beijing and they invite Fang to like a banquet, and it causes a lot of hubbub. And of course, the Bush administration decides not to punish or castigate the Chinese. They instead castigate their own administration. So these radicals, namely Feng Lizhi and Wang Ruowang, and then Liu Binyan. These three guys are the main ones that he doesn't purge, and then he basically gets pushed out of office. So Zhao Ziyang replaces him, and Zhao Ziyang is somewhat similar, as he's like a little bit of a reformer, at least if you compare him to Dung. So Dung.
My worst favorite graffiti artist, second to Chaff.
Doing, dung, and chaff. It's a very, very local Kaohsiung joke. Zhao Ziyang, so he replaces him as general secretary. However, who did retain his seat on the Politburo standing committee, so he's not totally kicked out.
So what was his position on the standing committee? Because I think those have the positions in there, like you need to have a fixed position to be on the standing committee, right? I don't remember, but
I'm not 100% on that. I don't know his exact position.
Secretary of Sewage and Waste Management.
It might have been something like that.
A secret tip for everyone: the secret key that nobody knows to not getting bit by mosquitoes is wear more clothes.
Just like
I invented it.
The trick to not get sunburned is also wear more clothes. These are facts. Because you don't want to put that sunscreen on you, because then like gives you cancer.
Well, it depends. I've heard word on the street is that mineral sunscreens are better, but I have no idea. They have some weird stuff in them. Some of them are like titanium oxide. I don't know if it's totally biologically inert. Do your own research, folks.
Do your own research. Look at the documents.
Well, I need to throw these jeans out. These things are big.
The ones you wore to hike the other day?
Yeah.
Those things are blown out.
There's a big hole in the crotch.
Oh, yeah.
These are old.
It's all right. It's the fashion nowadays.
I remember wearing this Gloria like 5 years ago, but like 5 years ago. I brought these to Australia on a vacation in 2017. So yeah, at least 5 years ago.
It's good to get use out of your clothes. You can sew that up, bud.
The crotch burnout, that's going to be rough. A lot of pressure there.
Yeah, you can do it.
It's not like a tear, like the thing is totally frayed, like the fabric is destroyed here.
Patch.
Yeah.
Patches, bud.
I've patched my crotch before. It does not look good.
That's a statement.
You just have like a giant weird bulge in your crotch all the time, and like a lot of sewing. I remember one time I was hiking and I was in I think was I with was I alone? Maybe I was with you. I can't remember. Anyway, I was in a cave and I slipped. I was like climbing up a rope wall and I slipped, and the only reason I didn't like break both my legs and fall down is I caught myself on my crotch on a rock. It just like tore the fabric and like caught there. Like I didn't get hurt. It didn't like rip skin or anything like that. But yeah, the crotch of those pants were blown out.
Well, that's a lot better than your ankles or your actual crotch being blown out. So.
Yes, I agree.
So
I agree.
You didn't do too bad. Well, I'm glad you didn't hurt yourself. Crotches save lives, folks.
Yeah, those caves are dangerous.
Man, climbing in general is dangerous. I had that one fall on that rope that broke, and that ever since then I've been much more careful about climbing.
Yeah, climbing is leave that to Alex Honnold and Joe Rogan, Elon Musk, all those people.
Leave it to the intellectual dark web. So, yeah.
My least favorite acronym.
I know you don't like it. We can say the IDW if you like that better.
Let's just call them Joe Rogan's friends.
The Rogan crew. Much inferior to Joe Bogan. So anyway, getting back. Oh, I said Feng Lizhe earlier. It's not Feng Lizhe. It's Feng Lizhe. I had a typo on my outline here. So these three have basically been discussing reforms that would have significantly, or according to some, possibly totally overthrown the CCP. They were in like positions of huge power, so it obviously wouldn't have happened anyway. But regardless, you can't talk that kind of nonsense and think you're going to remain a member of the CCP. So Zhao Ziyang comes in, takes over his position, and basically everyone in the party abandons Hu. Everyone except for Xi Zhongxuan, who like
Xi Jinping's father.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. She actually like lashed out at a bunch of people like in one of the meetings when they were like chastising him and getting him out of his position. And who like had to talk him down and be like, "It's not worth it, man. Like, don't lose your
son will be the greatest leader
Your son
in a generation.
Be the penultimate leader forever and ever." So this basically, of course, like further endeared him to like the people that wanted to reform stuff. And like I said, he stayed on at the Politburo in April 1989. He wins again, but then
Wins what?
he like wins re-election to the Politburo, so he remains on. He was like shortly after that, like slightly over a week later, he was in a meeting about educational reform and died of like a massive heart attack. He didn't die right away. He suffered the heart attack on the 8th and died later on the 15th at 73. Reportedly, his last words were that he wanted to be buried in his hometown without any extravagance. Whether those were actually his real last words or not, we'll probably never know. They wrote like a nice obituary for him, the CCP did, but basically like didn't talk much about his death and kind of just like didn't want anything to do with it. His wife was clearly super pissed. Whose wife, Li Zhao, like...
Did he have a heart attack?
Well... She thought it. She said,
"How dare you?"
She said, "It's all because of you people." Basically, she thought that.
Who the hell was she talking to?
To the CCP leadership, and this is what a lot of the student radicals and the workers that form Tiananmen basically say, is that they think that like them pushing Hu out is why he had his heart attack.
How old was he when he died?
73. So they have. Eventually, after like a lot of pushing, they have like a state funeral for him. Mourners lined up for 16 kilometers. That's 10 miles for the Yanks. And the party leaders were like really not expecting it to be so many people showing out. So people kept calling for like a more elaborate funeral. They wanted him to like be shown a lot more respect. And they really started criticizing Li Peng, who's quite a famous figure in all of this. Peng is much closer to Dung, very conservative, and he was the premier at the time, for anyone that didn't know. And they're basically like criticizing like this trash funeral that they give him, and talking about like the corruption of these old men, which is not prescient at all with what's going on in a lot of countries around the world with the gerontocracy. So actually, this is in the future, of course, but Hu was eventually like rehabilitated by another Hu Jintao. Partially because a lot of Hu Jintao's rise was like at the same time as Hu Yaobang, and also Hu kind of helped him out. Hu Yaobang helped Jintao a decent amount. So on April 17th, students come together and they create a list of demands for the government. So they eventually come up with a list of 7. These 7s are, number 1, reevaluate Hu Yaobang, especially in relation to his pro-democratic views, basically so they could potentially like reinstate him or like reverse their decision.
But he was dead.
Right, but they could at least like, after his death say like,
reinstate his body.
We were wrong, or apologize for it, something like this. 2, renounce the 1987 anti-bourgeois liberalization campaign and the 1983 anti-spiritual pollution campaign, and rehabilitate all the people prosecuted in these campaigns. 3 was reveal the salaries and other wealth of government leaders and their families. I like that. I like that. 4 was allow the publication of non-official newspapers and stop press censorship. Let the Free China Post post their stuff, folks. Next was raise wages of intellectuals and increase government educational expenditures, which I'm fine with intellectuals getting paid more, but this is something that we'll see like over and over again, is that the student radicals who get a lot of the focus on this, and somewhat rightfully so because they were most of the people in Tiananmen, really fought to keep workers out of this movement.
Why?
What
do you mean keep workers out? Like keep it separate from labor? Or?
Well, one of the things they did was the laborers were calling for a general strike, and the students were like, do not do that. Do not do a general strike.
Yeah, why?
It's hard to say. A lot of people give different testimonies. What I would say is partially selfishness. I think a lot of these students kind of wanted to make it about them. This is my conjecture. I want to make that clear. I think, but like another thing they did was they had like a lot of security on the square, like the students' own security, where they would like check documents and stuff, and they would not let workers in, at least into like the inner like recesses of like the middle of the square.
You had to show your student ID to get in?
Basically, they would have people there to check who you were, and if you like weren't like one of the student leaders, like they wouldn't let you in, or like affiliated with the student leaders. It was very like cliquey, and like the workers were basically, even though the workers like heavily supported the students at the very beginning. So this is something I would like to go in deeper on, like subsequent revisits of this, is like this dichotomy that was kind of drawn, because I think people overlook it a lot.
Seattle, whatever.
Occupy. Just kidding. That wasn't in Seattle.
You know what I'm talking about.
You're talking about the Chaz. The Chaz.
You're talking about
the Chop.
Oh, you got to bring Chaz Bono into this. Not everything's about trans issues, Jordan.
Most things are, though. So what
yeah, the same. I guess I sewed these pants up before.
Do it again.
Yeah, the idea that they're basically like cordoning off an area of the city and like enforcing their own entry rules into it. It's like a kind of cliquish occupation.
Yeah, from what I know about Chaz or Chop, depending on what you call it, that like occupied area in Seattle was much more open, and a lot of the reasons for it being locked down were fears of violence, which they got shot at like multiple times. So that I kind of understand. Each other? No, by like 3%ers, militia members. So that I kind of understand. These people were just keeping other people out because they, like, again, a lot of these student leaders, and like they did a lot of good things and should get recognition for that and for their bravery. But I think they're also kind of the sons and daughters of like more wealthy people, the upwardly mobile like middle class in China at the time, and yeah, like kind of wanted it to be about them. And all of them, they literally, like in some of the meetings with the CCP, first of all, they were like quite disorganized in some ways. In other ways, they like did a really good job coming together. And this is another problem with trying to have like specific leaders of movements instead of like broad
ideas.
Like broad ideas that you stick by. Yeah. So is that you have people trying to gun for leadership and caring more about recognition than the ideals of the movement.
Don't I know it?
Because there were literally like fist fights in some of these meetings over the mics, like trying to pick who was going to like talk to these CCP officials, and like there's a lot of disagreement, and we'll get into some of that as we go along. But yeah, like I said, hopefully on subsequent recordings of this, maybe next year or the year after, I'll be able to find some of these documents, and like go into this much more deeply, because I think that is an interesting thing that is not often talked about in terms of the Tiananmen Square movement and massacre. The next one is number 6 is the turn down the 10 provisional articles regulating public marches and demonstrations promulgated by Beijing municipal government. And number 7, provide objective news coverage of the student demonstrations in official newspapers.
This was in fall of 89? Wait, but Tiananmen was in June of 89, right?
Yeah, this is in April of 89.
Oh, April. I thought you said November or October.
No, I'm spitting out a lot of dates.
Yeah.
But no, Hu Yaobang dies in April, early April. So this is when they came up with this list of demands was mid-April.
Okay.
This was on April 17th is when this was handed over to give people specific dates. I'm trying to give specific dates, but as long as we know broadly where we are, that's the most important thing. So, as mentioned earlier, this is all happening while China is like opening up, which means more demand for education. Elites are making a ton of money and flaunting their wealth. So you have, like I said, the workers earlier. These workers are sometimes getting like losing their jobs or getting screwed out of pay raises and things like that. Meanwhile, especially like high-level CCP members are driving like foreign-born sports cars and flaunting their wealth.
Did you say foreign-born sports cars?
Did I?
Yeah.
Foreign-born. Well, foreign-made is what I meant to say. But they were born in foreign places. If we want to anthropomorphize these cars. So you also had like more contact with like the outside world. So I talked about earlier Fang Lizi. He had taught at Princeton. So you have some of these people going abroad. Yeah, I know, Ari, I agree. And like seeing democracy firsthand and coming back and making these pushes back against the system that they view now as more authoritarian than maybe they had seen growing up in it. So there's more and more people speaking out, like Fang Lizi, and some of these student activists and workers also. Specifically for Fang, Dung denounced him and said that people like Fang and his ilk were basically worshipping the West in their lifestyles, which sounds to me very much like the anti-gay argument in like the 90s. Their lifestyles. I don't agree with your lifestyle. So a little bit about Fang Lizi. I think he's also another important actor in this. Is according to Kissinger on China, Fang supported individual rights and Western-style democracy. He was expelled and imprisoned for a year in the anti-rightist campaigns in 1957, and then rehabilitated after Mao's death in 76. He was a prominent scientist. Like I said, he's an astrophysicist and the vice president of the University of Science and Technology of China, which is in Anhui province, in Hefei. So when HW visited China in February 1989, so this is just right before the protests started ramping up, the U.S. Embassy recommended inviting to a dinner because they were kind of like looking back at Reagan. When Reagan visited Moscow, he met with like a bunch of dissidents. So it's a good way to whitewash the fact that we're kind of buddying up with some of these more authoritarian people. If you want to look at it negatively like I do. If you want to look at it more positively, you can say that they're trying to like have dialogue with people even in these authoritarian countries, and also take the criticism of those regimes and the problems of the average citizens more seriously. So I try to give a both sides-ism here. But I think they forgot how much the CCP hates dissidents, because the CCP agreed, but then they basically said he can't have a press conference and he can't sit anywhere near the other CCP officials. He has to like sit at the back of the dining hall. But when the day of this banquet came, the CCP state security stops his car and just detains him for the whole time the dinner's going on. But U.S. press got a hold of it and then published it everywhere. And Bush got a ton of shit for this. And I mean, as he should have. And instead of like blaming the Chinese for reneging on their deal, what he did instead was he had Brent Scowcroft, who was the national security advisor at the time, give a briefing that blamed Winston Lord, who was the U.S. ambassador to China at the time. And I've seen interviews with him, and he still seems quite bitter about this. He doesn't seem super happy. He it's from what I've heard him talk about, he feels like they basically betrayed him.
I don't understand how they would blame an American official for a Chinese decision. What was their explanation?
They accused him of not checking with them. He said they said like he kind of like just made the decision on his own, which is nonsense.
What decision?
To invite this guy.
Oh.
To invite Fang Lizi. So it's nonsense, man. Like they're full of shit. Like, yeah. Anyway, after 2 months, he's out of a job. So there's like a completely new guy in like when Tiananmen really starts popping off, which is also was probably problematic for some of the stuff that happened. In the aftermath, Fang is scared that he's going to go to jail for a long time, and so he rides with U.S. officials on the like him and his wife.
The aftermath of the dinner, you mean?
Of them detaining him and like all this bad press that the CCP was getting.
Okay.
So he like lays on the bottom of a U.S. driven van with his wife, and he lives for a year in the embassy before fleeing to the U.S.
Okay.
Now we're going to get into the protests. The protests began. So after Hu's death, remember, he died on the 15th of April, 89. You have more and more people starting to come out to protest. So even by the 17th, we have the CCP already saying that students were being obstructive to the Great Hall's operation and order them to disperse. On the 17th, they did, but that night they basically came back. So it just goes up and down. But a lot of them quickly figured out that like basically the way to go about this is not to be like down with Dung, down with the CCP, is to be like super political, super not political is not the word I meant to say.
Marxist.
Yeah, basically super patriotic, and use the government's own slogans against them. So we'll see like numbers of instances about that, but it also quickly like starts to get more violent, because on April 17th they are trying to get into Xinhua Gate, where Zhongnanhai, which is like the party HQ for the CCP, they're trying to get in there to like talk with the leaders basically, and of course the police blocked them. And so by April 20th they persuaded a bunch of them to leave, but like 200 were still there, and they start to have like scuffles with the police basically. April 22nd you have Hu's state funeral, and about 100,000 students marched in the square. The government had ordered the square closed for the funeral, and the students were kind of like, yeah, you can get fucked. The funeral was inside the Great Hall of the People, which no one was allowed to enter, which I find like a great irony of all of this is everything is like the Great Hall of the People, but the people aren't allowed inside. So Zhao Ziyang delivers his eulogy. The whole funeral together is only 40 minutes. Everyone's like, this is rushed. Like, this is nonsense. You guys are this is like just a show, which obviously, I mean, it was. A few of these student radicals are eventually allowed to enter. Three of them got onto the steps of the Great Hall and presented a list of demands to Li Peng. So Uar Kaishi, which is another guy that people have probably heard of if you study Tiananmen, he stood beside them and made a speech, and it was short, but it was like pretty emotional. And it like Li kept they were like begging Li to come talk to them, and they wouldn't. So Uar Kaishi is like constantly having to calm the crowd down because they're like getting pissed off and trying to like slam into the crowd. Eventually,
I don't understand. The crowd
into the crowd of the police. Sorry.
Okay.
The crowd is like running into the police blockade, and like they don't like it doesn't totally break down to like anarchy and fistfights, but there's a lot of pushing and shoving basically from all the reports that I saw. So no one ever comes out, of course, and the students start classroom boycotts. They start calling for these classroom boycotts, but it like quickly ramps up because there was like rioting that night in different parts of the city. There were arson attacks in Xi'an. Shops near the Xinhua Gate in Xi'an were looted, and there's like hundreds of arrests. I think the number I saw was 350. But it's not. This is another thing that people often forget is it wasn't just in Beijing. There's like protests going on all over the country. We just don't have a lot of the documents because a lot of it was destroyed. And most if not all of like the like foreign media were in Beijing, so that's where they like we get the videos and the pictures and like the coverage of it, whereas most of it gets erased from history. Of like one example, even at this early part, was in Wuhan, university students protested against the provisional government. So you'll usually hear it like mentioned in these books, but there's like very, very little history about this stuff.
How did they know about the other protests? Like, how did this movement? Because they didn't. Not only did they not have the internet, but I can't imagine that these were like covered by state press, and there wasn't any free press at the time, just like now. I mean, so
that's true. However, they had some access to like outside media. For instance, one of them was Radio Free Asia. I can
imagine that like along the coast, but I can't imagine like in deep central China, like
in a lot
Wuhan.
of I don't know exactly like their exact reach, but you could get it deeper than just on the coast. From what I've understood from this, they could basically get the broadcast. The other thing is that at this time, there's also like a lot of dissemination through like cassette tapes and stuff. People will record stuff off the radio and then pass it along. Or another way that people were doing it was they would literally take down these broadcasts and transcribe them and print them out on paper and like put them on poles or like mail them to other people. So it's not like instantaneous, but there are ways. And obviously they have phones as well.
Yeah,
so,
I suppose.
So you can still make phone calls and stuff. But yeah, I
not cheaply though. I can't imagine it's very cheap.
I would imagine not, but I don't actually know. But yeah, they could definitely disseminate information just much more slowly. So basically, things keep escalating. You have Zhao Ziyang called for a meeting with the Politburo Standing Committee, and he stressed three main points. The first one was to discourage students from future protests and to try to get them back in class. He also said to use measures necessary to combat rioting, use all measures to combat rioting, and also to open avenues of dialogues with the students. So he's trying to be tough, but also he's more sympathetic to the students, and it thinks that like basically there should be more dialogue, and that's going to be the way to deal with it, rather than Li Peng, who's more of a like crushed the protests, like more of like a Dung style like authoritarian. So Peng ordered Zhao to condemn the protesters and take more decisive action. So on April 23rd, Zhao leaves Beijing to travel to North Korea on a planned state trip, and a lot of people were calling for him to stay, and it probably hurt his cause overall to leave, because during this time you have kind of a ramp up of tensions instead of like actual dialogue, which he could have perhaps pushed for if he was there instead of leaving. This is the same day that students from numerous different universities formed the Beijing Students' Autonomous Federation, often referred to as the Union, which is what I'll probably refer to it a lot as. So they elect a chair, and they have like numerous leaders, like including Wang Dan and Wu Erkaixi, which those are names that probably people who have a cursory knowledge of this have heard of. They call for more boycotts across Beijing, these classroom boycotts, and basically to organize together. And the party is like really starting to get nervous at this time. Li meets with the Politburo Standing Committee, the mayor of Beijing, and the Beijing Party secretary on the 24th. And they, as with a lot of like protest movements, they label these protesters as counter-revolutionaries and say that they're trying to overthrow the Chinese government and China's political system, and of course also the CCP.
They were.
I mean, some of them were. It's broadly speaking, a lot of these people are just calling for like mild reforms. It depends who you're talking about. It's like a very amorphous group of people. But yeah, certainly some of them were, but most of them aren't. They're just calling for like, can we have more than one person in this election? Like even if they're both CCP candidates, or like, can we vote, or have a lot of it is anti-corruption. Honestly, it's like, can we have more clarity into like earlier when it said like disclose your finances, these kinds of things. the standing committee agrees. Zhao Ziyang wasn't there, so who knows if he would have been able to help, but he lost any chance to because he wasn't there. So the next day, you have Li Peng meeting with Dung at his house, and Dung supports the tough stance and said basically, they have to like show these students, and they have to send out a warning and then like take a strong stand. So the day after this, on April 26th, the People's Daily publishes a front page editorial called "It is necessary to take a clear-cut stand against disturbances," is the title of the article. It's like a pretty famous article. This is like the third paragraph, I think. Some abnormal phenomena have also occurred during the morning activities. Taking advantage of the situation, an extremely small number of people spread rumors, attacked party and state leaders by name, and instigated the masses to break into the Xinhua Gate at Zongnanhai, where the party central committee and state council are located. So I'm not going to read the whole thing. People can go check it out. It's really easy to find. It's got its own like Wikipedia page and stuff. You can also go to tsquare.tv. They have a bunch of this kind of stuff on there. And I'll put all the sources in the descriptions of these podcasts. But basically, they say like, the vast majority of these students are like very peaceful, and they just want to show that they're patriotic. But there's a small like dangerous group of people infiltrating it, like causing violence and all this stuff. Which, like, is mostly not true, but, like, yeah, of course, there are, like, some people that are, like, more radical in there. But they quickly, like, kind of expand this out to mean more and more people. Yeah, they use the phrase extremely small number of people, like, 10 times throughout the article. So they're still not, like, fully cracking down. The day after this article this really, like, pissed off the people. So the next day, 50 to 100K students marched from mostly universities in Beijing to Tiananmen Square, and the police try to stop them. There's actually like really cool video of this. The police are like all locking arms across the street, and the protesters just walk through them, like break down their little police line. This was
Tiananmen?
Yeah, going to Tiananmen. They're like blocking off like some of the streets.
It's not in. It's like outside.
Yeah, it's like on the edge. Yeah, it's on the edge. And this is something that I'll discuss in a little bit, but and I kind of discussed it in the first about it not like a lot of the violence being outside of Tiananmen is like there's so much activity going on like on the periphery of Tiananmen, like in these like little communities surrounding it that like gets pretty overlooked. But like I said, we'll go into it a little bit. So there's a lot of students more and more start calling for like anti-corruption and cronyism, and like I said, they're like using the own CCP rhetoric like against them. The CCP had like as we all know, has like a history of being able to like threaten people, and they kind of back down. But one of the quotes from one of the protesters was, he said, "Many of us felt that our great patriotism was insulted." Now, whether that's like he knows that. Whether that's like a planned statement or not, like it shows that like a lot of these people do view, whether this person did himself or not, a lot of these people did view themselves as like patriots and like really just wanted to make the country better.
Yeah, that's what everyone always says.
Of course, that's the other thing is like we can never know like what people really think and what their true intentions are. We can only try to like suss them out through their actions, I suppose. So pressure keeps mounting, and the CCP is like kind of starting to cave. They made all these like threats like in that article that I talked about, but now they start to invite the student leaders to sit downs, and there are like so many of these meetings that I'm just going to touch on a few of them. And even reading like primary source documents, everyone has a different opinion and a different story about how like each of these meetings went. Not even just like on each side, like each individual student leader had like a different recounting of the story, so it's can get a little confusing. So April 29th, they basically meet with the CCP. They discuss the editorial that they published, the Xinhua Gate incident, and then press freedom. So Uar Kai-shi refuses to attend, but actually, this was like a pretty productive meeting, and from what I've seen, it seems to have like softened the government's stance a little bit. One thing I will say, interestingly, about Urarkaixi is we'll talk about this coming up. Is there were the hunger strikes. There's actually a story from an American journalist. During the hunger strikes, Urarkaixi like went out with this journalist and like broke his hunger strike and never told anyone about it, which is crazy. Like no one.
Why is that crazy?
Because he like broke his hunger strike and they like didn't ever announce it. I don't know. I just thought it was like I had never heard anyone talk about that until I heard it from this journalist that like went out with him, and the journalist obviously kept it quiet because he wanted to keep his source. But that was interesting. The next day on April 30th, Zhao returns from Pyongyang, and so the government is starting to moderate a little bit on these protests and kind of try to work with them. And then also Zhao Ziyang returns, so I think he's also like somewhat of a moderating force. So in early May, Zhao Ziyang asked for some media coverage to be loosened, and also he gave 2 speeches. In the speeches, he talked about the demonstrators at the May 4th movement had promoted science and democracy in modernization of China, and the students should do the same thing. So he's actually like talking pretty positively about the student demonstrators as much as he can. He also at the same time is praising Dung in his speeches for his stability and his like adherence to like principles. And he said that they're also calling for like the punishing of those practicing corruption, because that's the aim of the party. So he's like a little bit playing to both sides, or at least saying nice things about the students while also saying nice things about Dung, so he doesn't get attacked by either one. And he's kind of in some ways like the replacement to Hu Yaobang in terms of now he's like their ally inside of the government. I think probably he also thought he'd like thread the needle on that, got off the stage and was like, fuck yeah, fucking nailed it. But it also led to less students protesting. So a lot of them like kind of felt like, okay, we kind of got like our concessions, and like they're going to maybe moderate a bit on this. However, as we all know from history, this is not exactly what happened. This is a quote from a book called The Power of Tiananmen by Zhao. After May 4th, all of the universities except for Beijing University and Beijing Normal University resumed classes. Although most in Beijing University had voted for continuing the class boycott after May 5th, more and more students actually went to class. In fact, by May 9th and 10th, radical students in the university had to picket in front of classrooms to stop others from attending classes. So this like almost ended the movement partially because of Zhao Ziyang's speech, and also people are just like, okay, like we got some. They didn't even really get concessions, but they got rhetoric, and that was enough for people, which I think.
It's always the case.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of reminiscent. Is that people just kind of want to be acknowledged, right?
That's why we do everything.
Yeah, people just want attention. Maybe you could say that. Yeah, unfortunately, which is why you have to stay radical, or at least stay serious about your movement. So, this is a good book, by the way, The Power of Tiananmen. I think it's got a lot of good details and a lot of good analysis of what happened. Zhao Ziyang did get some criticism for his speech from the party, even mainly because he didn't send it to the party before he gave the speech, so he didn't give it up for review. So we start to see more and more factionalization between Li Peng and Zhao Ziyang, this kind of more conservative and slightly more progressive factions of the party. So because some of the more radical student leaders didn't want to be co-opted or to like allow the movement to basically putter out, they wanted to go for a hunger strike, okay, like I kind of mentioned earlier, and many were not really in favor of it, but Chai Ling, who's another student leader, which people may have heard of, there's a really famous video of her choosing not to go out on June 4th because she's like, I'm not going to like lead people to slaughter. Like, I'm not going to die for this, basically. And I'm not going to take other people to go out. But she's like, she's a big part of why it didn't end. This whole movement didn't end earlier than it did. So she like steps up at this time when it looks like people are going to vote down the hunger strike, and she says, "This is another quote from the Zhao book." She says, "My hunger strike is for the purpose of seeing just what the face of the government is, to see whether it is intended to suppress the movement or to ignore it, to see whether the people have a conscience or not, to see if China has a conscience or not, if it has hope or not." So she gives this long speech, and basically there's a number of testimonials from this, like after the speech, that people were like, "Oh, she like got me going, got me excited to like keep going," and so they end up voting through the hunger strike. So by May 13th, they're starting the hunger strike. You can see like a lot of the pictures of or videos also of like them giving speeches, like while they're in the middle of this hunger strike, and the students don't look good. Like they look pretty sick. I guess hunger strikes, they look like Ari after a morning of intermittent fasting.
An afternoon.
Just kidding.
Yeah.
No, you look good after you look good after that. That's why the pods are so hot when we record them in like the early noon time. More and more students start to come from around the country. So like we talked about earlier, it's not like it's spreading super fast, but as it is spreading, there are more and more students coming from all over. There's actually stories of people trying to get onto the train and them refusing to let them on the train to travel to Beijing, and students would literally just lay in front of the tracks, like on the tracks in front of the train, and be like, "Okay, run me over then," like, or let me on the train.
Did they get run over?
No one got run over. They would usually just let them on the train. So the students are like more and more organized, arguably, and they start calling for like apologies from the government over like the beatings that police had given out. But obviously the government's not moving a whole lot on that issue. They don't want to they're not going to apologize to anyone. There's a meeting, and they're talking about basically having like some sort of agreement to end this strike. So the government right now is really worried about a famous man who's about to visit. Do you know who that is, Ari?
Kissinger.
No, think more Soviet.
Kim Jong-il.
Not that Soviet. Actually, technically more Soviet, but not that dear leadery.
In that era, I mean, Gorbachev.
That's right. So, Mr. Gorbachev is about to visit. So the government is like willing to basically kind of like say like, "Okay, we're sorry, like we messed up, just go back to class. Stop protesting." And a lot of the students, including Wu Kaixi and Wang Dan, were set to agree to this. They were going to end the hunger strike and withdraw from the square on May 15th. However, during the meeting, Ling and Feng Congde, who's her husband, left the meeting. They're like, "We have to go take care of something in the square." So they like go out and rile everyone back up, and they're like, "No, we're not leaving."
She's responsible.
At least partially. I mean, Feng Congde is also, and like a number of other people. Like, regardless, all of those people have some measure of their own personal responsibility. One of Ari's favorite things. So she riles them back up, and then now they're not leaving. But the CCP is getting more interested in ending this, so they don't embarrass themselves in front of Gorbachev. So yeah, like I said, there's a lot of like fighting in some of these meetings that are happening. There's one meeting right before Gorbachev got there where they were trying to end it, and Ling again, they're like fighting over the mics. They find out that they thought that the meeting was being broadcast to the other students. They find out it's not being broadcast. Ling starts playing the hunger strike declaration on a cassette player, and they're just like all fighting. And so it ends in chaos anyway. So Gorbachev arrives, but only got like a small reception at the airport because he was supposed to like go to the square and like, oh, blah blah blah, like this, have like this massive thing. But there's too many students there, and a bunch of them are like starving themselves, so it looks really bad. So by the 16th, Dung meets with Gorbachev, and they had to enter party headquarters from the back, like as to not get like yelled at by the students, but also so Gorbachev wouldn't see as much of it. But I mean, he obviously ended up seeing it anyway. Gorbachev actually doesn't really take a stance on it.
I'm sure he knew what was going on.
Oh no, he definitely knew, but I think he chose to like not take either side because, interestingly, a lot of the students idolized Gorbachev. They saw him as a reformer inside of the Soviet Union, so they're actually like, kind of like supportive of him and want him to like take up their mantle a little bit. But I think probably old Gorbs was probably mostly focused on like bettering Sino-Soviet relations. So there's like over 3,000 people hunger striking by May 16th. Tons of like ambulances going in and out because people are like too sick. And you also have more and more police and PLA calling for the government to negotiate with the students. So they're like routinely like over 1 million people coming to the square on these days. May 17th and 18th, there's well over 1 million people on both of those days. You also have some more working class solidarity. You had the All China Federation Trade Union and the Communist Youth League that joined in solidarity, both in the square and like in the surrounding communities. And you also have like 127,000 students coming from outside universities to Beijing. So by May 18th, Li Peng meets with hunger strike organizers because, again, he really wants to end this strike. They basically obviously didn't want to give the government the satisfaction of ending it. Oh, that cat is loud. So the meeting doesn't really accomplish much, and it's kind of unclear exactly what went on. But they came to an agreement to end the hunger strike.
I just want to add here, I just looked up. So the Soviet Union was already going through a breakup during this time. So by the time Gorbachev went, Moldova, Estonia, and I think some of the other Baltic states, Armenia had already broken off from the Soviet Union because of protests. So there was already like a dissolution of the communist system at that time.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that's why maybe they saw him as like a kind of reformer, that he was allowing that to take place, and that may have also laid the groundwork for the response that China gave, which is that we're not going to cede control.
Right. Yeah. I'm sure they could read the writing on the walls of like, yeah, this is the Soviet Union is starting to like see the sand slip through their fingers, so to speak. I think that's a very good point. On May 19th, after they agreed to end the hunger strike, at 10 p.m. that night, the student leaders tell the press that they're going to end the hunger strike. Like, right after this, like, breaking, we interrupt your regularly scheduled broadcasting to bring you this important message. Beijing city leaders show up on TV, and Peng drops the hammer and says that the government was going to take firm and decisive measures to end the turmoil and safeguard the CCP's leadership in the socialist system. So he's like, oh, thanks for agreeing to end your hunger strike, which was one of like the main tools for gaining sympathy that you had. By the way, we're coming down on you hard.
Well, maybe his idea was that it was already over. So like anyone who's not gonna fall in line at this point, is outside of the system, outside the agreement, so they can go flip themselves.
They can pound sand. Yeah, I think that's probably a fair reading of it, but I don't think that that's how the students gauged it. I think they gauged it as, okay, we made some progress and we're gonna ratchet down, so you also need to ratchet down. But obviously that's not how they saw it. That's not how the CCP saw it. On the next day, martial law is declared, which the students, that's one of the reasons they ended the hunger strike, is because they didn't want martial law to be declared. Some people did keep on with the hunger strike because this was another thing that like really divided leadership. Was like a lot of people wanted to continue, but other people wanted to use it as kind of a bargaining chip. You have 10 to 15,000 troops trying to enter the capital from outside of Beijing, like over the highways. And this is where you start to get like the real violence breaking out, is people in like the suburbs around in Beijing stopping the trucks and they would do all kinds of stuff. So a lot of them tried to like reason with the soldiers. They would be like, these are your comrades, these are your brothers and sisters, your sons and daughters. Like, you can't go in there because there's going to be violence. You can't go in and like abuse these people. Other people took a little more like radical and violent take and like were like assaulting the soldiers. But in a lot of cases, what they would do is basically they'd like stop their trucks, they'd bring them food and water. They'd like the student. Some of the students would hold parties for the soldiers to like entertain them and like make friends with them. But like in certain parts, it seems like especially in like the western part of Beijing, I believe there's like tensions start to ramp up, and there's like a lot of bad blood created, which I think will come back to the forefront like later.
Too much partying.
I think it was like too much arguing and like actual like fist fights, and also people stealing stuff from the military. So these people, like reading about it kind of made me think back to like the Hong Kong protests and like them building barricades, because they would build barricades across these streets with just like whatever they had lying around. And the soldiers, a lot of these people are like country soldiers that like had no idea what they were going to do. Like they were just sitting there. I'm sure some of the, obviously some of them knew, especially the commanders, but they didn't really know what they were supposed to do. And when people asked them, they'd give like all wildly different answers. Like some of them would obviously say like, oh, we're going to like secure the square. But some of them would say like, oh, we're going to make a movie, or we're going to go do like an exercise in the square. So a lot of them really didn't know. There's a number of interesting videos about this, of like people basically like doing like street preaching to these people and asking them like not just to like turn around and go back and not like attack these students.
Yeah, with a military command structure, that's a big fucking ask. Like,
well, we'll see in a second that it worked for a little bit. One, they're like stopped, like they can't move. Now, of course, they could always just open fire, but there's like some interesting videos of like these people talking, and you can see like the more like older experienced officers like pulling the younger officers who are kind of just like staring at these people, like listening to them talk, and they'll like pull them away or like turn their heads and like make it so they're not listening to them anymore. So like I said, some of them like are entertaining the soldiers and trying to like make them enjoy themselves and ingratiate them, but others are like telling like they say like all soldiers are bastards, or like another quote that I saw was "Go home, your mothers are dying," which is like a very like reminiscent of like Umao and insults on Twitter.
Well, this one doesn't sound like an insult. It's saying like go take care of your family, as opposed to go causing trouble elsewhere. It doesn't really sound like an insult to me.
Maybe, I don't know. It sounds not like a nice thing to say. You could say that in a nicer way than your mother is dying. But anyway, you kind of start to have like sporadic violence taking place. So like on May 20th, a bunch of policemen clubbed a bunch of people in the crowd, like 45 people injured. The same area on May 22nd, you have the 133rd Division, which we'll come back to a number of times because they're one of the main divisions. Basically, they turned back and they agreed to negotiations with the students. And then after they were like turning around and leaving, a bunch of people in the crowd started throwing bricks at them and like screaming to like kill the soldiers. Government numbers say like 116 soldiers were wounded and 29 of them seriously. So it's like you do have like some of these like radical elements that are like in it, like just to, I mean, you know,
to win it.
They're angry, and that's understandable, but they're like using tactics when they've already basically accomplished what they wanted to do, which is get the soldiers to turn back, and they're making it worse and driving up this resentment, which again I think is going to come back to bite them in the ass later. They do eventually withdraw on the morning of the 22nd, and they start having more delegations. Another interesting thing that was also reminding me of the Hong Kong protests is that one of the military higher-ups gave the students a map, a military map, and they also found like two phones, and so they would get like a hotline of where the troop movements were every 3 minutes, and so they'd basically coordinate like all this. They'd have these plans all laid out, so they were like coordinating where the troops were going, and they would like go like, okay, you need to put a blockade on this street, and like, oh, this university, you need to be on this area. They had it like very well organized to like keep the troops out of Tiananmen. So I think it's like does show that they're like while there's some like disorganization within some of it, there's also moments where they're like supremely organized, almost like a military insurgency themselves. They're also giving handouts and stuff to these soldiers, cassettes. I know you love cassettes, Ari. So they're handing out like cassettes, basically pleading with these people to not beat up these people. Okay. So on May 23rd, you have a meeting held in the creation of the Joint Federation of all circles in the capital, or the Joint Federation. So this is basically like a big tent party of all these other student groups, which doesn't really work out because it's too many people trying to all work together, similar to America's Democratic Party. But the intellectuals wanted to lead, the student leaders wanted to lead. Everyone kind of has like mistrust of each other and thinks that they would obviously make a better leader, as it always goes. You have people that think that they should start pulling out. You have people that think they should like go back on hunger strike. People that think they should stay, that they should get armed and like have conflicts with the military. So the next day you have like oath-taking ceremony with a lot of these leaders trying to become leaders of this joint federation, and a lot of it ends up being the student leaders. And so basically the power is essentially handed back over to the Beijing Student Autonomous Union, and kind of like backs out of the deal that they had made originally. So they put a bunch of these same people in the leadership. So eventually not much changes, because on the 27th you have the Joint Federation holding a meeting where the majority votes to leave the square by May 30th, including Ling and Feng Congde, the two that had like worked to keep it going for just previously. However, Ling and Feng Congde changed their mind a little bit later, which seems to happen all the time. And Chai claimed that it was like a plot to do this vote. So she was like, this was a plot, we're going to stay. And she said that the vote didn't have a majority, but this is like a group of a bunch of like a patchwork of leadership. So like there's no enforcement mechanisms or anything like this. So they're just kind of flying around, and it's kind of like majority rule, I guess, to some degree or another. Or maybe manipulation by the leaders in some cases. There's a lot of good information from Hong Kong journalists. One of them talking about this says, although the proposal, talking about the proposal to withdraw from the square, was passed by a majority vote, it has no force. What surprises us is the suggestion of various movements or organizations, including the decision of the highest level organization, the Joint Federation, must have the final approval of the defending Tiananmen Square General Headquarters. The majority must follow a minority, which is absurd. So I think that like sums it up pretty well, is that like they had created this like big tent party that they were supposed to all follow, and then now it's reverting back to the old kind of leadership. They kind of did like a little coup almost. They're supposed to have like a parliament and like all these kinds of things where they're doing voting, but it all doesn't really work, and they don't really stick to it at all the times. So you have some leaders now getting expelled, like Wu Kaishi and Wang Qiaohua. They got expelled from leadership in the area itself for basically advocating for the students to vacate the square. So now like kind of more and more radical students are starting to take over, and those that are disagreeing with them, they're just kicking them out. Also, something to think about is like the way that they got money. I was like trying to look into this a little bit, is like super interesting, because like how do you get money to like those organizations and distribute it like correctly? There's like a lot of accusations about like corruption and graft, but I think a lot of it was just like unorganized. So like a lot of things would get lost or sent to the wrong places. But there's tons and tons of money pouring into these like into the square, because they have to like feed, sometimes hundreds of thousands or even millions of people every day. That's something I would like to see if I could find more details about. But there's a lot of the original money too was tied somewhat to the state. People would get it through other unions donations or things like that. So anything that had any ties at all to the state obviously starts to dry up, especially after around the 22nd when Li Peng is getting more strict about it and saying people are going to have to leave. And also people are a little bit more reluctant to give money. Some because of the accusations of graft, but also people are also just one, worried about getting found out. So they don't want to really get in trouble. But you had people, especially overseas Chinese, donating a lot. They had seen the cover of Gorbachev, and so they felt some solidarity with the students. And there's also, of course, just like there are in other Chinese cities, there are a number of international demonstrations in solidarity with the students. Hong Kongers actually were also super supportive, and in total, one estimate says that they donated 13 million Hong Kong dollars.
It's $2 million US
at one event is what they said. But yeah, they donated quite a bit of money. And Hong Kong students also sent a delegation and were quite active in the movement. They were actually one of the reasons that they kind of cleaned up what was going on, because at the beginning it was you can see it's kind of a festival atmosphere.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Sounds like a lot of these where you get a bunch of young people together and it's just silly power struggles and stuff like that, overruling their actual overarching goals.
Yeah. I mean, it happens. I don't even think it just has to be young people. I think it happens in a lot of places. People's egos get involved.
Especially with young people, though.
Yeah, I guess.
Old people don't have time to protest because they have jobs.
In terms of to some degree. I mean, people do strikes and pickets and things like that.
Yeah, but those are very specific and limited, and those are usually hierarchical in and of itself. Most people won't strike without a hierarchical structure giving them some guarantees that strike is going to hold together. So that's why it's this kind of chaotic stuff. I'm not saying young people are the only ones who are chaotic. I just mean that if you think of any case of that, it's always young people.
At least certainly the majority that I can think of have been. There's also this when it first starts, it's not an ideologically focused movement. So it is kind of like a festival atmosphere where it's we're just here to speak our piece and kind of have a good time. There's videos and pictures of people
good time, man.
Dancing and listening to music and just
Gross.
Doing fun stuff that Ari views as banal and beneath him. But the Hong Kongers actually did a really big thing with they sent a bunch of sleeping bags and tents in and were helping to distribute them around the square, and then that kind of helped the students get more organized. They started to clean up the garbage and refuse that were lying around, and they also started disinfecting because a bunch of people were getting sick all the time. From millions of people being stuffed into Tiananmen Square. I mean, you had literally hundreds of thousands at points sleeping rough on the square. Sometimes just sleeping on the square, sweating and all the other fluids that come out of you when you sleep in a big pile of people. I think there were times when they started to do some of these reforms that it shows that they were deeply interested in continuing to fight and not give up, and possibly to narrow their focus a little bit, as some of the people who were just there to have a good time kind of peeled off. The Hong Kongers also brought other things too, food, and some of Ari's favorite things like walkie-talkies.
I do like walkie-talkies.
I know you do. They start to make these improvements, but around May 22nd, around this time that I'm talking about, a lot of people do start to return to class. So their numbers by the end of May dropped to 10K. So it's starting to drop off. One of the things, whether this is actually what re-sparked the desire to protest for some people or not, It came at the same time, which is the goddess of democracy is revealed, which has also been famous in the Hong Kong protests. So it arrives on the square on June 1st and seemed to like get people back into the spirit. Everyone can go Google pictures of the goddess of democracy. Some people say it's based on the Statue of Liberty. Some people say it's not. I don't fucking know. But anyway, towards the end of May, you also have more and more soldiers, especially plainclothes officers, driving into the city, basically to get there without being stopped by the civilians. What you also have, though, is because they're sending these plainclothes officers, a lot of times they're not sending them with weapons. So they would send like these armament cars, these cars with like stocked full of guns and grenades and helmets and stuff. And some of them are getting stopped by locals and like they're literally confiscating guns from the military, these like local civilians, which is pretty wild. And obviously this leads to like more violence. So like I said, the west side of Beijing seems to have like a lot of the violence itself, but you have 3 civilians were run over by a military jeep in Mushidi, and the
where
in Mushidi.
That's a weird place name.
I don't know. I don't make the names up. I just read them. The government said that the jeep was loaned to civilians and was owned by the Beijing police and used by CCTV for the last 10 months, but I don't think that's true. And also CCTV is a state entity anyway, so that would still be government employees running over a bunch of civilians while they're like speeding down civilian roads in a jeep. Anyway, civilians in the area, according to reports from them, believed that there was an altercation and the civilians were basically talking trash to the military and got killed because of it. There's obviously tons and tons of issues with the violence growing and growing. Now we're basically getting up to it, getting to June 3rd. The morning of June 3rd, students and residents in Beijing stopped 3 tourist buses carrying military equipment. And a group came out and basically took all the guns, the grenades, the ammunition, gas masks, helmets, all these things out because they were like, you're going to use grenades against like student protesters in Tiananmen Square, and they like put it on the street to like show everyone what was happening. Martial law headquarters sends 500 soldiers to recover the weapons, and they like fired tear gas and beat a bunch of the civilians. And there's a number of these conflicts happening all over the day of June 3rd, which obviously June 3rd and the early morning of June 4th is when most of this violence happens. So on the night of June 3rd around 9 p.m., the military surrounds the square and they begin to converge. They're basically making these like concentric squares around and moving in. They were ordered to clear the square by any means necessary, but it's really confusing because different generals report like different orders. Some say that they had been given permission to fire if absolutely necessary. Some of them said they were ordered not to use their guns at all. Some said that they were ordered that they could shoot their guns into the air if they needed to. So it's like we don't really know what the orders were. And like each military battalion had different rules about like how the ammunition was held. Like some gave it to one person who held it all. Some gave it to the officers only. Some gave it to everyone. So yeah, it's like I said, it's really confusing. So basically, this is where this assault on Tiananmen begins. And I mean, I don't know what you've heard numbers wise, but from what I've heard, the numbers have ranged so far that I just think it's like not even, I don't even know if it's worth it for me to like speculate on what the numbers were.
Probably not.
They range from like hundreds to literally over 10,000s. Like there was that declassified British telegram that said it was like 10,000 plus. So I just think that it's even like journalists who like literally got shot or beat up on the scene report like wildly different numbers. But let's say hundreds to thousands of people ended up dying in this, and certainly thousands were injured. In terms of soldiers, you don't have that many deaths. The 38th Army reported 6 deaths, 159 critical injuries, and thousands of soldiers beaten. They also had 49 armored vehicles and 65 trucks destroyed. You can see this a lot. There's a lot of like improvised incendiary devices that the civilians come up with. Like there's a number of videos of like these government like APCs and stuff just being lit on fire, and that's where a lot of the soldier deaths come from. Like I said, in the western area of Beijing, where there had been like more conflict, that's where most of the people get shot. And there are like a ton of allegations about basically like probably what amounts to revenge killings, where people were found in like defensive positions just like executed. So there was definitely some of that. The civilians are still trying to hold the troops out of there, so they actually spend hours just fighting through certain areas, like on the outskirts of the square, just to get to the square. And there are all obviously the allegations of like them like crushing up people with APCs and like dumping their bodies into the sewers and things like that. It depends on which documents you read.
The good ones.
I only read the best documents. So the the atmosphere of this is like insane. It's like you have like the lights on the lighting up the square, and like just the constant blaring of these messages that like troops are being sent in to like put down the counter revolution on the United States. Civilians basically told to stay home. Journalists are told like basically if you go outside and we catch you with like a camera or a recording device, like we have rights to shoot you on sight. Is basically what they said.
Well, it sounds like they claim they have a right to shoot anyone.
Yeah, I mean that's basically true. That's basically true, and they certainly did shoot quite a few people. So you have a bunch of people just terrified for their lives, like fleeing from the square. Of course, eventually there's like 4,000 people that congregate by the monument to the people's heroes, and by 2 a.m. they're like completely surrounded. They start singing the Internationale. Which was a very common thing to do at this time, is like they would just start singing the Internationale because...
Oh, singing like is always the wrong thing to do when you're about to be murdered.
Well, here's the thing. These people don't end up getting murdered.
Probably because
they
it would
sang
have been
the
too
Internationale.
humiliating.
The two of them, two of this group, like go to negotiate with the military, and they said like, please, we'll leave the square, just like let us march out of here. And the military actually agrees. So soon the speakers start blaring, students, we appreciate that you will leave the square voluntarily. Students, please leave in the southern direction. So they now, of course,
Look how they use please.
well, you got to be polite, right? You can't be mean about it. So now some of the students that like want to stay and literally like defend the square to the death, they have like weapons and stuff. They're like pretty pissed. There's some workers in there too. One of the workers tries to hit one of the student leaders with a pipe, calling him a traitor. So you have like this big debate, like will we or will we just like, will we basically stand here and die, or are we going to march out of here and like maybe live to fight another day? But honestly, most of them would end up getting arrested. But I guess they wouldn't get murdered in the square. So by like 4 a.m., the military's like, you guys got to hurry the fuck up. Like, we were told to clear it by daybreak. If you're not out of here, like, we're going to come after you. And there's like obviously just chaos everywhere. You have like overcrowded ambulances. Like there's ambulances that are getting shot at. You have hospitals that are like full to the brim. People just getting laid outside like with blood all over them. There's a lot of like pictures and video that people should go look up of like how horrific and like hellish this scene was. So finally, at 4:35, the students march out of the square. The soldiers rush to the monument of the people because the people's heroes, and the students had loudspeakers where they were like playing stuff and like doing announcements and stuff. And the soldiers like shoot down the speakers, and they march behind the students to like make sure they go out. Like reportedly, the mood was like pretty mixed. There's some people like obviously weeping, some people singing Ari's favorite song, the Internationale.
I don't know that song.
And
my favorite is still Old Town Road.
Yeah, it's a shame they didn't sing that one. they people that didn't want to leave were like drugs kicking and screaming. They kind of like formed a big like square of people and would like or like a long line and would keep like the a lot of like the smaller and like less strong people, I guess, in the middle of it to protect them. So they eventually walk everyone out, and the soldiers throw their helmets in the air and celebrate that they won. But yeah, throughout the morning, there's numerous reports of like people being like bleeding on the sidewalks, being bayoneted to death. There's all kinds of stories, and I think you could probably do a whole podcast on just like the firsthand accounts from different people that night, and maybe at some point I will do that. Last thing we got to talk about, June 5th, your number one boy, Tank Man. Whoa. There's just like tons of crazy stories about Tank Man. Everyone knows that picture. What was that?
Just mosquitoes.
Skaters. Like, even how the people got the pictures is crazy. Like, one guy took the picture. He's waiting for the picture.
It was a video.
Well, there's pictures and videos. One guy who took like the famous picture, he was like gonna take the picture, and he had, I think, like a 400 millimeter lens, and he was like, it's too far away, and he had a lens doubler. So he's like waiting for this guy to get shot, and he runs back to his bed, throws a camo doubler on, and then like runs out and gets the shot. And at the same time,
so this is the next day when they're already clearing it. I assume he not like at severe personal risk taking this shot.
These people were mostly in apartment buildings, but yes, they were at severe risk.
Overlooking.
Yeah. These are most of them. There's one guy who took a street level picture, and he didn't see that it had Tank Man in the picture, and he didn't like publish the photo for like 20 years because he didn't realize it. And eventually, someone going through the archives found it. I think he was like an AP photographer or something. They like eventually found it. They're like, holy shit, this is like a historic. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but there's like two
I'll Google it.
Chinese men like ducking and running away.
I believe we say
Not the preferred nomenclature. Asian American, please.
It's the only street level picture of Tank Man there. And so yeah, it's pretty interesting that it was lost to history for so long. The guy that the camera, the lens doubler story I was telling, that guy snuck the film downstairs and had a exchange student smuggle it to the outlet he was working for in his underwear. Another guy who also took a picture from the apartments took a picture and then hid it in the tank of a toilet in his apartment because he saw there was like minders up on like other buildings, and he saw them see him take the picture. So he like threw that picture inside of a film canister and inside the toilet, and then he handed over a different film canister. And then came back like days later, and the film hadn't been flushed, so he like got away with that one. For the video that you were talking about, there's like crazy stories about that too. They smuggled that out of the hotel, and then they had like this rudimentary machine that would send video back frame by frame. So they sent like 5 frames, I think it was, back of like the video via this, like, it would use telephone lines to send video. And then what a lot of these journalists said they would do is they would go to the airport and find Hong Kongers, and they would give it to or people going to Hong Kong, and they would give them like these films and stuff, and they would have them sneak it back to Hong Kong and then mail it out from there. So there's like an insane amount. The U.S. Embassy compound was they did like drive-bys on the U.S. Embassy compound. So you had a bunch of journalists were working out of there, and Larry Wartzel, who was a U.S. military attaché at the time, he had his apartment shot up in this compound, and he said that he was warned by a member of the PLA, basically like, listen, after 10 a.m. on the 5th, like, don't be at your apartment. Like, it's crazy, just like crazy stories. And I mean, Tank Man, obviously we have no idea what happened to him. Like, some people thought he was basically some people swear that he was just like drug, because he's drug off the street by like a bunch of people after he like bangs on this tank and stuff. And some people think he was straight just executed, and other people swear that like he was rescued. But I mean, obviously we have no idea. But there were like huge rumors that there was going to be a Chinese civil war, that like parts of the PLA were going to like basically rebel against the government. And then they created the 21 most wanted list and arrested a bunch of these students. A bunch of them fled, obviously. But yeah, just craziness. But yeah, I think that's all the story I have basically to tell this time. I hope to make this more maybe concise and narrative based next time, but I had to get some of this stuff out. I just want people to like hear some of like the broad information and kind of hopefully be a little bit more interested in the topic.
We're going to talk about some of the reactions when we pod next week.
Yeah, we sure can. I don't know.
Because I'm curious about how, I forget about like how the Chinese government or the foreign governments, I think most of them condemned it, and then very quickly, like within a year or so, just were like, forget about it.
Yeah, that's kind of...
Normal trade relations are more important.
Yeah, that's pretty much what happened. Yeah, that also with the reports of like deaths and stuff, that with like the Chinese government, the Chinese Red Cross initially coming out with like 500 deaths and then like quickly changing it to like a handful. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that comes out in the aftermath that I think is interesting that we can probably get into on at a later date. But
well, thank you. Dinner time.
Yeah, I hope everyone. Yeah, shout outs and solidarity to everyone who's like protesting their authoritarian governments right now.
Hopes and prayers, folks.
Yeah, I mean, hopes and prayers and solidarity all around. By the way, Hong Kong is there's actually a number of like artists right now outside getting arrested, doing like art and stuff, because they're not allowed to do their Tiananmen vigil for like the third year in a row. So that's why protest and democracy are very important, because otherwise you end up in an authoritarian state where you can't even fucking talk, can't even speak your mind. It's sad.
Oh. All right, good night, folks.
All right. Night, folks. The cat says good night, too. We love you. We'll talk to you soon. FCP